All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the October 3rd, 2024 meeting of the Federal Secure Cloud Advisory Committee, or FSCAC. My name is Michelle White, and I am the designated officer, or DFO, for this advisory committee. I would like to thank all of our presenters, attendees, and stakeholders for joining us today, including those who provided public comment. Public comments submitted via the FSCAC public comment form by Wednesday, September 25th have been provided to the committee members. Before we start, there are a few things that you should know. This meeting is being recorded via Zoom. This is an advisory committee that is statutorily required under the James M. Inhofe National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023, and thus formally established under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, as of our charter's official filing date of February 28th, 2023. This committee is considered a federal advisory committee and is governed by the requirements under FACA. My role as the DFO is to manage the day-to-day administrative operations of the committee, attend all committee meetings, and to ensure the committee operates in compliance with FACA. The duties of this committee include providing advice and recommendations to the GSA Administrator, the FedRAMP Board, and agencies on technical, financial, programmatic, and operational matters regarding the secure adoption of cloud computing products and services. The majority of the work of this committee is focused around the FedRAMP Authorization Act of 2022's statutory requirements and purpose. Specifically, it is to examine the operations of FedRAMP and determine ways that the authorization processes can be continuously improved, collect information and feedback on agency compliance with and implementation of FedRAMP requirements, and to serve as a full forum that facilitates communications and collaboration among the FedRAMP stakeholder community. I will now go through a roll call for all of the committee members. Please let me know you are present by stating here. Larry Hale.
Here.
Michael Villacerca.
Here.
Carlton Harris. Kayla Underkoffler. Josh Kruger.
Here.
Daniel Payne.
Here.
Marcy Womack.
Here.
Bronco Boken.
Here.
Matt Scholl.
Here.
Bo Burles. Lamont Yarborough. Nauman Ansari.
Here.
Jackie Snellfer. Bill Hunt.
Here.
And Joshua Cohen. Thank you all. It does look like we have a quorum established. So I would like to go over the purpose of today's meeting. It is twofold. We want to agree on the structure of the FSCAC report to the administrator, and we want to begin drafting an initial set of recommendations for the committee's first two priorities. The intended outcomes for today are to have an agreement on the report structure and a documented set of initial recommendations for the draft report. Our agenda today is as follows. Welcome and call to order to take place from noon to 12:10, and then we'll jump straight into our public comment until 12:30, and then some quick chair remarks until 12:35. Next, we'll dive into our first discussion on the report structure until 1:05, followed by a short 10-minute break until 1:15. Following the break, we'll spend the rest of the meeting discussing the committee's individual discovery and drafting initial recommendations, which we capture live in the report template. Finally, we'll end the meeting no later than 3 o'clock by sharing next steps and closing remarks. If at any point we ended an agenda item early and are ahead of schedule, we will move on to the next item and allocate the additional time to drafting the recommendations. A few housekeeping items for our committee members and speakers today. Please be sure to identify yourself before speaking, so those listening online or reading the minutes afterwards can know who made which comment. And this is a virtual meeting. Please make sure that your microphone is muted anytime you're not speaking. When it's time for the committee to deliberate and you'd like to raise your hand, please click on the reactions button in your menu bar and then click raise your hand. And remember to lower your hand when you are done speaking. Lastly, if you are not a committee member, please hold all your comments until the public comment period. And again, please ensure your microphone is on mute otherwise. Let's move on to our public comment period of our agenda today. At the time, we would like to welcome members of the public to share their comments. To our speakers, please note a timer will display on the screen indicating your time remaining, and the alert will indicate that you're out of time. Each speaker is allotted 4 minutes to make their comments. We will be interrupting speakers to exceed 4 minutes. So please speak succinctly and please be respectful of the time. As a reminder, all public comments submitted by Wednesday, September 25th were presented to the committee members prior to the meeting. And with that, let's get started. As a quick recap, our producer will take us to our public website to show us where the public comments are that we received so far. So we've received a few comments. So begin by calling on those who submitted some comments online in case they are in attendance today and would like to elaborate further in this meeting. Colin Whitlatch, would you like to speak? How about Scott Beauregard? All right, well, if anyone else would like to speak today, please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order that you have raised your hand. All right, it does appear that we do not have any comments, public comments for today. So with that, we will go ahead and conclude our public comment section for today. Thank you all. We will now transition to our first agenda item, chair remarks. Welcome, Larry. As the committee chair, I would invite you to make any opening remarks at this time. I will be happy to answer any FSCAC-related questions that should come up.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to provide a brief recap of our priorities and what we covered during our last meeting, and then set the stage for our meeting today. If I can move, there we go. As you all know, during our July meeting, we further refined our top priorities and decided to begin developing recommendations for these first two listed on the slide. I'll give everyone a minute to reread these. We were also given 2 additional priorities from the GSA Administrator, but we agreed to address them after working on these 2 initial priorities first. So our work today will be focused on these 2 priorities. During our last meeting on September 12th, we heard from OMB on the FedRAMP policy memo and its impact, gained a better understanding of the challenges stakeholders face during the FedRAMP authorization process, and we received excellent feedback from both industry and agency liaisons on our top 2 priorities for the year. We also agreed to complete our own individual research while awaiting and working on a new social media account. Today, we'll agree on the structure for our report and then begin documenting our initial recommendations in the draft report. Please note, today's overall purpose is to begin drafting the report. Nothing on the report is final until we hold an official vote. I encourage all of you to speak up with any key information or initial recommendations you'd like to propose. The formal vote will, of course, take place at a later date to ensure there's a dedicated time for thorough deliberations. What questions does the committee have? And remember, please use the raised hand feature in Zoom to begin to address your questions. I know I don't need to tell this committee not to be shy. While you're thinking about the 2 priorities and any questions you may have, let me just give you an update on our social media status that I mentioned earlier. FSCAC staff are still working on getting a LinkedIn account set up and hope to have more information in our next meeting on the status of that. So if there are no questions, I'll pause for another minute and then we'll jump into our next item for today. So as I just stated, we are going to determine our proposed report structure. So let's review the proposed report structure that the FSCAC staff have drafted for us and determine if there's anything we'd like to change or modify in order to reach agreement on the structure. So as you can see, the producer has brought up the structure in front of us on the screen. So this draft report was sent to committee members last Thursday, September 26th, for your initial review. The structure was based on what was used for the last report to the administrator. After having reviewed and reflected on the previous process of drafting a committee report before, does anyone on the committee have requests for changes or modifications to the proposed report structure? Since I know this is not a shy group, and I don't see any hands coming up and nothing has been typed into the chat, I'm going to assume that based on having received this on the Thursday, September 26th and conducted your initial reviews, that the committee agrees on the basic structure. Let me just ask once again, if there is anyone here who can't live with this report structure, again, it's a replica of the structure we used last year. If there's anyone here who can't live with that report structure, please indicate so by raising your hand now.
And Larry, it looks like Michael has his hand raised.
Great. Michael.
Hey, Larry, this is Michael representing cloud service providers. I just had a quick question on the actionable specific recommendations. In that section, is that where we would see potential metrics and metric thresholds as something that we would in this report?
Certainly, if the committee, if in our recommendations, if we want to propose metrics, that would be the place where they would be. Michelle, am I making a false assumption?
Nope, I completely agree with you, Larry.
Okay. Mike, thank you for that question, that clarifying question. And yes, if the committee proposes metrics with the recommendations, this is where they go in the report. Any additional questions?
Marcia has
Yep.
her hand raised also.
Hi, thank you. Marcy Womack with Shellman. We had some discussion within the last deliverable about kind of like additional commentary to support some of the kind of succinct summarization or more just things here. And this is an open question. Like, is there merit to us having an opportunity to add additional commentary or context to some of these recommendations? I personally, I would lean toward yes, at the risk of bogging down the document, because I think sometimes that might be important for the recommendations, but just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, I believe so, and I think that the committee notes may be the place to do that. But yes, I think we need to be as clear as, while being concise, I do think we need to be as clear about our intentions and our concerns. And so I would say yes.
Very good.
Yeah,
And I
maybe,
apologize. I missed the committee notes section. I was looking at the original version that was sent out. So, and sorry to cut you off, Michelle.
Oh, no worries. What I was going to state is, in our deliverable on the OMB memo recommendations to the GSA Administrator, we did have an appendix that we attached with some additional information. We could do a similar type of action with this document too.
I like that. I mean, because there's some stuff we may want to put in committee notes, but if we need to go further and amplify deeper, we could put that in an appendix. We definitely want to be clear, you know. I mean, that's the thing. We want the product of this committee to be clear and actionable. So anything we can do to help clarify, I think that is appropriate and welcome. Other hands? So once again, just to validate that as a basic structure for the report, when we do actually draft the report, I am concluding that we have consensus, we have agreement on the structure. Again, if you can't live with this structure, please raise your hand now. Michelle, you ready to move to the next item?
All right. Yeah, sounds great. I will say the next item was a break, so we're going to go ahead and skip that right now and move on to our next item, which is starting the deliberations, and we can potentially take a break during the deliberations portion. So basically, we are going to be moving on to the deliberations on the initial drafting of the report. So Larry, back to you on doing the deliberations.
Absolutely, and thank you, Michelle. Committee members, we have agreed upon a structure for the report, and as Michelle said, now it's time to go ahead and start actually entering our initial thoughts and recommendations that we would like to highlight for the administrator. So to ensure we address both priorities today, I propose we time box these deliberations. We're a little bit ahead of time, but let's spend not more than 45 minutes on each priority. So 45 minutes on the first priority, and then move on to the next priority for about 45 minutes. And that'll leave us with some time for additional comments at the end. So FSCAC staff, please be sure to keep an eye on the clock for us today. With that, let's dive in. We have received some initial notes from members who are unable to attend today. So let's review those quickly and also see if anyone has anything they'd like to add to these. These notes are about to be shared on the screen.
Can you see my screen?
We're still seeing the structure, the draft recommendations. Unless that's what you have under committee notes. That is okay. And so these are the notes we received in advance of today's meeting, which I misread as part of the structure, but I think we will include it as part of the structure anyway. So again, folks, we got a couple of comments from Kayla that we want to share. Give you time to read those.
Hey, Larry, I just had a quick question. This is Mike from CSPs. Could we make it so that we could actually see the priority as well as the notes on the screen? Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so looking at the first priority, identify and publicly document top challenges and propose solutions around the barrier. Does anyone on the committee have initial thoughts, having looked at Kayla's recommendation, initial thoughts on the problem statement or recommendations?
Michael, do you have your hand up or is it just the left up from the last time?
I will actually, I'll take it a little bit. So I think just from the problem statement to start with, I think a little bit of clarity around barriers of entry to make sure that we all understand this includes financial, technical, compliance, or operational barriers, or maybe a combination of them all, so that we've clearly defined that. Cost, resource availability, regulatory complexity, those are all the things that we're focused on. I could throw that in the side chat too, so if we need to copy and paste it into the notes. But that is, I think, having a clarity on what we're describing will help a lot. The other one is so the impact on innovation. So just highlighting how these barriers might be stifling innovation or competition. Like what's the outcome of the current state? So just emphasizing that there's high cost and complexity in the compliance space, and it's limiting participation, especially from small business, I think is going to be something that we should hit on in the problem statement or the derivation of the problem statement.
Thanks, Michael.
And Bill, you have your hands up.
Yeah, so hi everybody, Bill Hunt, SEC. One thing that came up that I found interesting in the last meeting that I hadn't really considered before was specifically to the resources here is the bottlenecks of the 3 PAOs and not having enough staff basically to even be able to respond. Not having enough 3 PAOs around, I guess, is kind of what I was hearing there. I don't have a really good answer for that, but to me, it's the first time I'd heard it in that context, brought up repeatedly by a few folks. So that to me just sounded interesting. And I see Marcy has raised her hand, so I'm eager to hear what she's going to say about that. I don't want to spend a lot of time picking apart everything that everybody has already said here. I will say that Kayla's note about the documentation burden, I think is very real, but I don't know of a specific and actionable way of resolving that, because literally documentation is the main point of this exercise. That's what we're doing here. So you either get documentation or you get OSCAO. And those are really the only two approaches we have to that. So if we're talking about specific and actionable solutions, I think that saying reduce the documentation is not sufficient to be specific and actionable unless people have other recommendations of specific controls that we want to address. So that would be my concern with that one, but I'll cede the floor.
Oh, Marcy, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is Marcy with Shaman. Just to add on, I would add that anecdotally, I would argue that it's not a 3 PAO bottleneck. But aside from that, there is an issue with like time to get through the authorization process for CSPs. All the things that come with this documentation, but there are phantom requirements. There are things that don't come up until the very end. And some 3PAOs know about it because they go through this process day in and day out, and some may not do it as often. And so increasing transparency within the FedRAMP program publicly is going to be very important. And the speed at which their documentation, guidance, et cetera, is published is very critical to making FedRAMP more accessible and allowing CSPs to realize the like financial benefits of FedRAMP authorization faster, knowing how much commitment goes into that to get to that point.
Sorry, Marcy, can we engage in some back and forth here for a second? You're
Yeah.
saying that there's not a 3PAO bottleneck, but our expert witnesses told us there was a 3PAO bottleneck. So
And I hear you, and I don't want to like deliberate on that too much, mostly because we personally don't find that there is. I mean, a few examples is, we have organizations come to us and say, hey, we need to go through this right now. That's always too late to start trying to engage an external assessor for literally anything. But also I would argue that there are a lot of organizations that want to start right now or want to start in February, and they aren't ready. They start and they don't have all the things in place that it takes to go through the process successfully. So I don't know there's a ton of merit to like argue that, but we don't find that that 3PAO capacity is a significant issue.
okay. I mean, again, I'll defer. That isn't what we heard necessarily, but y'all's experience I also have infinite respect for. I will definitely double down on the other thing you said though of people not being ready. I think we heard Tom say that in the last call as well. Folks just not knowing what even the process is supposed to involve and look like. So there's definitely the education issue there, and I definitely want to double down and strongly agree with what you said on that. Yeah,
and I want to be, in terms of there are certain improvements that could be made on the 3PAO side in terms of, it's pretty heavy-handed to, in terms of the number of authorizations or the number of assessments performed for authorization to like the top 4 to 5 3PAOs kind of, on the marketplace. If you do that sort, that's pretty apparent. So I think there's additional work that can be done to ensure that many other 3PAOs have the right information and have the experience with handling the PMO discussions, et cetera. So thank you.
All right, great. Josh, go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon. Josh Kruger, project host. Yeah, so, one of the hardest parts, it seems like, to get a FedRAMP authorization, if you have all the paperwork in line, there is no 3PAO bottleneck, all of that, is finding the agency sponsor. And the agency sponsor is the only way to get authorized right now, right? So, and part of it is the agencies just don't have the resources to jump on board to review, these packages at the level they need to issue the ATO. So is there something we can do to simplify, I guess, the ATO work for the agency? Maybe, I don't know. But, so the SSP and documentation, like Marcy said, people just don't know. They're not ready. They think they are. But is it, the agency really needs to review the CIS CRM, know what their responsibilities are. They need to review the SAR that has the findings from the 3PAO assessment with the vulnerabilities, get a good risk picture of the package. But do they really need to read through 500 pages of SSPs to see what the CSP is doing for each individual step? I mean, probably not. But it's adding weeks, months worth of work for those agencies. So is there, some type of modification we make to the SAR? We're doing, a million different presentations for the agencies and, kickoff briefs to make sure they understand the authorization boundary, SAR debriefs to make sure they understand the SAR. How can we enable agencies to issue ATOs and, save them from, excess reviews, I guess, or do people not see this excess? And then, I mean, and just the upfront cost that, CSPs have to do when it is, a year-long, 18-month long process to get authorized. I think that's part of the problem statement too. These smaller CSPs, they don't have the upfront, capital to pay for consultants, retrofit their environment to be compliant, build new environments to be compliant, hire the 3PAO with, often no initial investment from the agencies, right? Until they're authorized and, under contract.
I'd say you definitely hit on something, Josh, because you got a lot of hands raised after you started proposing this. I was going to mention that it's related to what Kayla recommended as well in her first note. But let's move on to the next hand.
All right, great. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, this is Daniel from Databricks. I kind of don't know if I agree with Kayla's point, only because I agree with the part of, centralizing the authorization authority for new entries in the federal marketplace. Like that all makes sense because we want the PMO to be, the main kind of distributor of information and the understanding. But I feel like removing the search for sponsoring agencies as a barrier, I don't know if that means we don't want people to go through the sponsoring process with agencies or what the case is there. But I think to Josh's point of the agencies being the bottleneck and how do we get around that, I do feel like there has to be some sort of agency mentorship program or sponsorship collaboration program or something like that for first time agencies to go through the process, or even agencies that have done this before but maybe are losing resources or whatever the case, they don't have enough resources to keep up with the demand. But I feel like that kind of helps with the education, kind of getting some of the work off of the PMO's back. We all know that they're super busy. And if you are going through the process with an agency, you want the process to be sort of the same across the board, right? And I think one of the points that Josh made was sort of around the time it takes, resources at the agency to get the work done. Well, when I was at, my previous agency over at HHS, we had the process down to 4 guaranteed weeks of, resource time that was specific to the federal points of contact, right? So we would basically say it's going to take us 4 total weeks, 2 weeks up front, 2 weeks at the end to get through this process. And we put the heavy emphasis on the work up front, working with the CSP to say, hey, this is what you need to start this process. And if you're not at this minimum bar, we're not going to start the process yet. And that was kind of to what Marcy was talking about as well. So if we can get to some minimum bar to say, okay, you have XYZ ready, we can start this process. And then all the work's on the CSP. And so now that I'm on the CSP side, I can kind of see, where that, benefited agencies to sort of say, okay, if we're all talking the same thing, we're all speaking FedRAMP 101 here, we can get things done and the CSPs can get what they need to do done, and then the agencies can work on whatever they need to in the meantime, and then circle back to actually finish the job there. So long story short, I feel like the education and putting the work up front will go a long way. But I think that there has to be some sort of incentive for these agencies, A, to sponsor, and B, to work with other agencies to get that done. So I'm not sure if that's like a working group. I know getting working groups set up in the federal government is a long and arduous process, but I feel like it would be worth the time and effort to have experienced agencies work together to help the smaller ones get through this process.
Bronco.
Hey. Hey everyone, this is Branko Bokan from CISA. I think I am a little surprised. I think we've been talking about barriers to entry for years now, and I think everyone is agreeing. No one questions that barriers to entry exist. What surprised me today is that we really know very little, or at least we've discussed very little, what those actual barriers are. I think one, the issues with agency sponsorship is one that's very clear. But for the very long time, we've been talking about the cost in terms of money, in terms of resources, in terms of time. But at least I personally don't have any details. We're talking about 18 months to ATO. Why does it take 18 months? What does that timeline look like? Is it the implementation that takes most of the time? Is it the ATO being stuck somewhere in the process on FedRAMP side? Is it the 3 PAOs that are taking too long? We need to better understand the timelines. We need to better understand the cost. We've been hearing numbers such as $1 million to achieve ATO, $1 million a year to maintain, but where does that money go? Again, we need some type of breakdown so that we can understand where the most significant costs are, and if there is something we can do in terms of recommendations to reduce that cost money-wise. Resources the same way. So I don't know if someone has any data to share that would be very helpful. If we don't have it, we need to do something about it before we can make a decision.
So can I respond to him without being called? Okay. So at least for timelines where they go, right? So, when you get your, you have to schedule a 3PO assessment, right? So then you get that done, 6 to 8 weeks for a SAR, right? That's once you're at the point for 3PO assessment. And then that goes to your agency. You have to do a SAR debrief with them, which usually takes a little bit of time. So to get that scheduled, based on their availability, because again, everyone's tapped on resources, right? So it goes to them, they review it, and then they start their, their full package reviewing their ATO work. There's agencies that do a lot of them. I've done several for the VA, right? Their process is 7 months long to issue an ATO. But they're doing everything that needs done throughout the process. It's just their process. Others, Department of Energy, for example, they're pretty fast. They can take like a month to do an ATO, right? So it's completely dependent on the agency and their individual workflows. I can't remember who mentioned earlier. He said, they had a 4-week process on their side. And then once it gets the ATO, then it goes into the federal PMO queue for authorization, right? And then you're in that queue, which, we've seen up to 26 weeks long previously. So, just from the 3PO assessment to, FedRAMP starting the review package is almost a year, depending on your agency. And the VA is, one of the top sponsors, right? So that's a lot of CSPs sitting there in limbo while they're working through the ATO process and then in the FedRAMP queue. And then you have to make remediations and everything to get authorized, once you meet the FedRAMP PMO and do the review meeting. So that's all, them sitting there burning consumption for their cloud spend, right? It's them keeping people on staff to do continuous monitoring, paying all their licenses for their tools, updating the documentation based on feedback from the 3PO, from the agency, from the PMO. All these things play together for CSPs, especially small CSPs, that just tap all their resources across the board. And if they're having to do a FedRAMP environment as opposed to a different commercial environment because they had to build a new environment to meet the FedRAMP requirements, then their staff split even farther. They have a snowflake environment now where they have separate CI/CD processes, and all the things kind of just stack up for those CSPs, and they're sitting there paying for it all while they're not able to sell and not able to get customers live because they're not authorized. I don't have specific costs on any of it, but I think until we were able to send surveys out and things, we're kind of stuck not being able to get that information, because people aren't just going to put it in the public comment section saying, hey, we go with this 3PO, they charge us this much, and then someone else is like, well, they only charge us this much. No one's going to answer that. So until we can do anonymous surveys or something, there's no way to get that information for specific costs.
Sorry, can I pick at that? I think that we can. The federal government can indeed and should be sharing the costs associated with these sorts of things from our side of the fence, right? At least what we are spending for the vendors that we are using for all of the going through the security process. So although the companies might not want to, but the federal government definitely should and be able to share that information, because what we're spending our money on is public data. So at least we have that side of it, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, here I was thinking the barrier to entry for CSPs was more the focus here, but we did talk about agencies as well. Yeah. And that priority. But that's it, Bronco. That was my response.
All right, let's go to Michael. Who's had his hand up for a while. And I believe, Michael, you also had some comments that you put in chat, so we do want to go over some of those comments too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to just kind of circle around. So I did run offline with some of the CSPs and brought together on this priority a problem statement and 3 actions there. They are CSP related actions, so we may want to think about broadening them in this meeting. But I wanted to try to focus us on like what is the problem statement that we're trying to hit on with this priority. So if you want to take a look at that, I'm hoping that I've wrapped that well enough to cover everything that we've discussed. And then out of the 3 actions, what we're really looking at least from the CSP side, is to say, is there a capability within FedRAMP for us to develop a tiered compliance system where small or low risk CSPs could have a set of streamlined requirements? The benefit there being that we could lower the cost and the time for those smaller CSPs. The second item is really around, can we establish a centralized assistance program for small CSPs? So can we create centralized technical and compliance guidance, templates, and resources, which we've discussed in previous meetings as well? And then is there a potential for us to get an advisement to the GSA administrator to potentially have maybe a staff member or an expert on staff or some type of rotational program set up where like large cloud service providers and/or agencies can provide expertise to small service providers. I'm sorry, it's to small cloud service providers. And then the third item is introducing the concept maybe of pre-authorized compliance packages to also lower that barrier to entry. And so around that concept, we were really looking at, can we, provide some kind of pre-authorization where if a service or if a CSP lines up with a particular type of service that they're delivering, or a particular bucket that they would fall into, that they would be able to use some of these pre-authorized packages or configurations to save time on their assessments and again reduce cost by inheriting these pre-approved templates and being able to use them on their behalf. These were three main categories from previous meetings again, and also talking with CSPs where we kind of brainstormed and put together what would help level the playing field for small CSPs, as well as potentially lowering those barriers to entry, streamlining the process, and as recommendations that we could bring to the rest of the GSA administrator for the FedRAMP program itself. So I know there's a lot here, and I apologize for just getting this all thrown at us. Thoughts, questions? I would love to debate if these are the right 3 actions, if we should be broadening them in some way, adding additional language. Maybe we could start with the problem statement itself at the top to see if we all agree on that.
And we still have a couple of hands up, but thank you, Mike, both for the written input and for your explanation of it. Really greatly appreciated. A couple of hands have gone down. Bill, your hand remains up.
Yeah, Michael, could you actually just elaborate on how number 1 is not the existing tiered system today, where we have low, moderate, high, and tailored? It seems to me that is a tiered compliance system.
So yes to it being a tiered compliance system. The way that I was looking at this was, or the way that the CSPs are looking at this is a little bit more around the CSP itself from like an infrastructure standpoint. So some of at least the feedback we were getting was a lot of the infrastructure layer for some CSPs, especially small CSPs, is being rated at like a FedRAMP high level, and then services within them are being applied at low or moderate. And so there was concern that, even from an infrastructure perspective, that they would have to get to their infrastructure at high first, and then they would be able to do some of these lower service levels for their individual services. So I'm not sure, that's some specific feedback we're getting around that capability, or I'm sorry, not the capability, but the I guess the onus of how we've been pushing CSP infrastructure in the past. The other thing that we were really looking at here was maybe there's outside of the low, moderate, and high that exists today, maybe there's a set of requirements that we could put together for small businesses that might be maybe a middle ground or between different varying levels that brings together enough of the requirements to create a small business set. That might be something that they're also talking about and look at as a perspective here. And again, these are recommendations to the FedRAMP boards for them to, or the FedRAMP PMO, for them to really come up with a way to approach this. So, but those were the two major areas that they were focused on, was like, can we carve out something specific for small business where maybe the requirements are the minimal set that are a blend of low, medium, and high, for low, again, for that low risk service, low risk CSP, which we would have to define in some way.
So picking at those, I appreciate the clarification first and foremost. But I'll say a couple of different things in various conflict here, and I'll try not to filibuster this meeting as I usually do. I think that FedRAMP tailored covers a lot of that for what you're recommending, and so I think that we should be directing folks towards that as one option. The other thing I'll say here, and then I'll bring this back around the tree, is as the federal government, I am not comfortable with saying because you're a small business, you should have a lower barrier to entry with regard to security requirements. If anything, because you're a small business, you present a greater risk to me as the federal government. And I know that that's unfortunate. I mean, I've used to work for the Small Business Administration. I want to see small businesses. I've run a small business. I want to see them in the space, but they do present a bigger risk to me than a large organization. Primarily, a lot of that cost though for them is in that documentation. And I want to highlight your third bit here, because I think the large majority of small businesses that are cloud businesses are sitting on top of a larger infrastructure provider. Most of them are SaaS. And as a result, it's incumbent on companies like yours, really it's the big three that I think to provide the hybrid inherited control package for them to inherit from. So I would suggest that this isn't a FedRAMP issue directly so much as FedRAMP working with the big three providers to make sure that there is some sort of a standard package, as you're kind of describing here, for that pre-authorized compliance package that covers that bottom layer, that 60% of the controls they're responsible for, rather than saying that they just don't have to do it. So I think that there's potentially a wonderful opportunity there, since that's most of the controls for them. But again, at the end of the day, I want to make sure that they're doing that remaining 40% very, very well and at a high level of detail, because if I don't know that they know how to configure their account management, all of that sort of like all the other controls that I do actually care about, those are the things that I'm going to be spending my time looking at, generally speaking, as a federal agency taking them through the FedRAMP process. So I don't want to give them a free pass, but I do want to make sure that those controls they are responsible for are getting higher level of attention to detail. So I agree with the principle, but I disagree on the approach.
Dan, you have a hand up?
Yep, Daniel from Databricks. I think one of the things that was kind of mentioned was like sort of the controls that are like, important or that are people want to highlight and focus on. I feel like that's one of the things in the problem statement is sort of like that minimum risk threshold. I don't know if I have the perfect solution for that. I don't know if anyone does, but I'm curious if that's something that, the group wants to focus on, or if FedRAMP wants to focus on as like something that, we all know the controls that people focus on the most within the NIST 853 framework. We all know the controls that, the PMO sort of looks at as sort of the heavy hitters. But they're not written down, right? So it's sort of that gray area where everyone says, okay, we know this control is super important. We're going to look at it every single time, but we're not going to look at, SA 54 like ever, so are we willing to put that down and say, these are the controls that if you fail one of these, you fail automatically, or, a combination of these failing is, you're out of the process, or is that just too much? And that's kind of an open question. I don't know if I have like the perfect answer for that, but we all sort of know that happens, and it's kind of, not talked about that often. But I'm curious if we put the pen to paper and said, these are the 20 or 25 or 50 that you cannot fail XYZ, and the other ones, then we can kind of have discussions around. That would be kind of interesting.
And Jackie, your hand is up next.
I think. I'm working on my controls here. Okay. Jackie Snoffer, DOD DISA. I just wanted to echo what Bill said, is that I just don't think we can have a lower standard for small business. A lot of times they don't have the back end people and resources necessarily to do a lot of incident response and those types of things. And I just have got to echo that, you know, we've got to have the same playing field. The requirements are there to reduce the federal government's risk in hosting in the cloud. We've got to figure out other ways to help the small businesses. Bill also talked about inheritable packages, and this is something that we have tried to do with the large vendors, is to create that inheritance model. And I think it's really important, even if we can publish something that says, if you host, there's got to be an incentive, right? So in the DoD, there's an incentive to that, because you can inherit. We only assess the controls that are not inherited from the provider. I think that's a critical thing. I don't know if everybody is approaching that way, but I think that would also help reduce the time requirements if we could get to the point where, when we look at a SaaS, what does that mean, right? And what are the controls we expect from a SaaS, and differentiating those from a provider that is got your infrastructure and your physical and environmental controls and those types of things. So I think that a lot of our small vendors are SaaS providers. And so looking at the models that we use, not reducing the requirements, but understanding who's responsible for those, is really critical to lowering that barrier to entry, right? And providing a shared responsibility model or something that they can start from. I just think is really critical. You know, y'all were talking about timelines. You know, timelines is a funny thing, just from an organization that does a tremendous amount of authorizations. So much of what we get is really dependent on the quality of the packages. And I heard one person talking about, well, we do a kickoff here and we do a kickoff there. And so hopefully the multi-agency construct is going to help. But it is really important to do that upfront work and to understand. And I've got to foot stomp this particular issue, which is a organization going into a 3PAO for assessment before you meet with the client, get the understanding the architecture and making sure really good. It saves you from having to do duplicate work. And really my last point that I wanted to make was that starting with a low doesn't help a lot, to be quite honest. So when we look at our defense industrial base, all of our contractors who are using, they have to have a standard of using FedRAMP moderates it's in our DFARS clause. And so much of what we do starts at a FedRAMP moderate so that we can protect our CUI. And so even starting at a low, you have gone through a lot of cycles and a lot of work and a lot of assessment just to get to a low that doesn't give you a big advantage. So how do we make that barrier to entry easier through the inheritance models and some of those other types of things? So just a few comments. So thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Appreciate that very much. Before we move on to Marcy and Josh, who have their hands up, I do want to just invite committee members, if you have edits to what you see on your screen, you can put them in the chat, proposed edits. You raise your hand and actually just state the things the changes that you want to make, and the producer will live edit with you. But please, we've got about 10 minutes left on this topic. So I did want to invite you to either submit it through chat or raise your hand and talk the producer through the edits that you want to make to what you see in front of you. And with that, we'll turn to Marcy. Thank you, Marcy.
Of course, thank you. Again, Marcy with Shulman. So a couple of things I wanted to kind of piggyback off of from a couple of the other members. So regarding like the minimum threshold, acceptability, standardized baseline kind of thing. I mean, there is the idea of the federal mandates, right? Like there's that table in, it's very front and center in the readiness assessment report, the RAR document. You know, that's like minimum baseline things that absolutely 100% have to be in place, else an authorization is like not possible, right? So, but something to that effect, maybe an expanded version of that might get to the point that Danielle was making. Whereas, you know, it's some of those air quote high risk controls that term's not used as much anymore, but 5 or 6 years ago, it used to be used pretty heavily when we were going through like the PMO review with CSPs for that FedRAMP authorization. So something to that effect might be helpful in some standardization. Secondly, going back to Jackie's point about inheritance, I think that the concept of, you know, perhaps, and I apologize, Jackie, if I'm mischaracterizing, but, you know, like when DISA does their review, like looking only at the SAS controls, not what they're perhaps inheriting from their IaaS, that doesn't really exist in like a programmatic structured way within the program. Like that is something that I know that the DISA team does, but in terms of how a package is presented, I don't know that there's a mechanism by which to streamline that. And it may be helpful to do that in some sort of like programmatic way. Maybe that's adopted with some of the OSCAL automation that's in place. Maybe there are other ways to do that, but ensuring that that's done consistently and across the board allows more just buy-in to reduce the review burden for agencies and PMO.
Can we articulate that as a specific recommendation?
I can do my best to drop it in chat and then we can play with the wording from there.
Thank you. I like that. I appreciate that. Michael.
Yep. So I did want to note that we do have a alternative number 1. So I've gone ahead and shared that, and it's been dropped into the text here. So let me know if this one focuses a little bit more on the automation capability as opposed to creating a tailored program for CSPs, which would hopefully also reduce overhead for the small CSPs. So feel free to take a look over the language here and see if this is a little bit more in line. Also, I do have an alternative number 3, because it sounds like number 3 is in line with what we are talking about around control inheritance. So I'm going to share that right now for Darcy to drop in. It does talk more specifically around inheritance as opposed along with pre-authorization. So Darcy, if you want to go ahead and drop that one in, it just adds a little bit more flavor around the inheritance itself. And so I think, Jackie, let me know if that matches the wording that you're looking for, or that at least the intention that you're looking for. And then I am out of alternative wording here, so the rest should be up for the committee to wordsmith.
Thanks. And I also want to thank you all for the research that you've done, the independent research that you've done that supports these recommendations. With that, Josh, your hand up is up next.
Have we, I mean, it's just, you know, kind of you know, on the DoD side for a lot of their systems, they're using, you know, a GRC tool, pretty much DoD-wide, called EMAS. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with it. Could that be used in any way on the FedRAMP side to help with the processes and the inheritance? You know, so if, you know, we have a package from the Navy inheriting from, you know, another system, the inherited controls, they can't even really look at or, you know, mark as non-compliant because they're inherited across the board. Is there a tool like that on the, yeah, or could we leverage EMAS? I know some agencies already do, on the federal government side. Just, you know, maybe that would help. It could ingest, you know, it could be the ingestion point for the OSCAL documentation and, you know, testing procedures and things like that to, you know, expedite the review processes and everything. I'm probably going to regret saying it because it'll probably be more work for me later, but yeah, I mean, that was really it. I didn't know if that might have already been considered, and, you know, there's a reason it's not being done. I'm just not aware of it, but it seems to really streamline, you know, ATOs on the DoD side.
Hey, Josh, this is Mike again. I'll pick that one up. We did go ahead and put out a request for an RFP, and I think a down select has happened for building a GRC tool on the FedRAMP side. I'm not the expert to speak on this, but I wanted to bring that up, as that was something that was on the table and being worked by the FedRAMP PMO over the past, I don't know, 6 months from previous recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
I think the next hand up is Bill.
Yeah, so in response to what Michael and Josh were just saying, I'm relatively certain that most civilian agencies use one of two tools to do this today for all of their control management, which it would be DOJ's CSAM, or Archer, I guess would be the other one. Sorry, I'm not supposed to name product names probably here, but whatever. So I think those are probably the biggest ones, and since DOJ actually owns one of those, that might be something to think about. But yeah, I do know that the FedRAMP team, we talked about this last season, about them going through and like wanting to put together a tool that could be used for exactly this. So that might be a hurry up and wait until that comes back around. My other point that I wanted to ask about is to Larry and friends, as a point of order here, I assume the recommendations that we're lining up here, we're going to be going through and voting on as we did last season. That we're wordsmithing right now, but this is not the final that we're talking about today. Am I correct in that?
You are correct. Yeah.
Okay.
This is deliberation and discussion, and there will be time for actual deliberation on the final wording. So this is kind of live editing, brainstorming, and discussion, which I'm loving. Because we're hearing a lot of good views.
All right. Well, I won't nitpick and debate in further detail then. Thanks.
I appreciate it, Bill. Thank you. And Bronco, your hand is up next.
Thanks, Larry. I just wanted to remind my colleagues of some of the principles behind these recommendations. Some of them were written up, I think, up front. If you scroll up a little, they need to be actionable. They need to be clear. I can't remember what else, but also these recommendations are from FSCAC to the GSA Administrator. Implement something. It is not a clear nor an actionable recommendation. What is it that we recommend that GSA Administrator does? Who is supposed to implement? Who is supposed to develop these streamlined frameworks? That needs to be clearly captured in that recommendation. Otherwise, this will just go nowhere.
No passive
this
voice.
applies to all of them. This is just I'm commenting on the first one.
Sorry,
That's
Mike,
very
I didn't
well.
Talk over you. No passive voice is basically the answer here.
Yeah, no passive voice. That's very well said, Bronco. Recognizing that everything we recommend to the administrator, somebody has to implement it. There will be resources, there will be costs, it will take time. But we want to make these recommendations to improve the process. That's our purpose for existing. So improving the process has to be the objective. Thank you. After Bronco, I think the next hand up is Jackie's.
Hi, thank you, Jackie Snoffer from DISA. What I was going to focus on really was the inheritance model and the GRC tool. And there's a real need, I think, for OSCAL. We're talking about the who, and I will confess that I am not an OSCAL expert, so it may be there. But is there a way in OSCAL that we can exchange an inheritance package? So this would start with FedRAMP talking about, from an infrastructure perspective, what controls are typically inherited, but then having the CSPs to be able to produce in their SSP or in something that says, this is a hybrid control, this is fully inherited, this is on the mission owner to implement, right? Or a SaaS to implement. And making sure that we have the available fields in OSCAL so that any GRC tool, regardless of which one it is, can actually bring that into the GRC tool to make it available, and also to be available to a 3PAO so that when they're assessing a SaaS, they know what controls to look at from a SaaS perspective, So I just think this model, the model probably belongs to FedRAMP to produce. We probably need to look at OSCAL to make sure that we can consume the inheritance model. And then on the tool side, we need to look at what our assessors are using so that when they go out to look at a SAS, they can ingest the inheritance model so that they would know what the delta is to produce inside of the assessment report. So I think that there's a whole pipeline there that would actually standardize, and as Marcy said, I think this is something we do in the Department of Defense, but it's not broadly adopted. We had to go down this path. We really needed to go down this path because we recognize that you don't want to reassess physical environmental controls of an AWS every single time you evaluate a SAS that sits on top of AWS. And so I do believe that there are actionable items at various places, from FedRAMP, 3PAOs, the OSCAL, that need to be done in this recommendation and space. Over.
Thanks, Jackie. I do want to mention, 10 minutes ago, I said we had about 10 minutes left on this topic. Because our opening sections, I should say, of the agenda went so quickly, and this discussion is excellent. We can give this discussion another 15, now 14 minutes. So again, understanding that as Bill pointed out, we're not voting today. We're wordsmithing. We're trying to come to a working consensus on these recommendations without actually conducting a final vote. Let's give another 13, 14 minutes to this discussion, because I'm really appreciating all the perspectives and the thoughts on these recommendations. There are no hands up right now, so I may have just given the commentators curse for the extra 15 minutes if no one wants to talk. But as we're watching the live edits and Marcy's responding to what she's receiving in chat, any additional thoughts, comments on what we've been discussing for the last 40 minutes or so? Yes.
Yes. So Bronco, this is Mike from CSPs. I added in language to cover the GSA Administrator recommending these actions with different organizations or parts of the organization. Does this cover what you were looking for specifically?
Yeah, I think this is moving in the right direction. This is more along the lines with what our recommendations should look like.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, knowing that as this says, so we're making our recommendations to the GSA Administrator, but ultimately, as you point out, the GSA Administrator is not going to do these things. He or she right now is going to recommend that somewhere in the FedRAMP process that these things happen, and recognizing also the limited resources of the FedRAMP program. Let's make our recommendations actionable and impactful if we can, please. So take a few minutes, read what's on your screen now, because we've tweaked them as we talked. Read what's on your screen now, and after a couple of minutes, we'll if we don't get any hands up, any concerns about what's here, we will roll into our break and then move on to our next agenda item after the break.
Hey, Larry.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Matt from NIST. Yeah, on one, stay on one there for a second. So it's implement a streamlined compliance framework, but then all of the actions and activities are around automation of current compliance framework. So is this really what we're doing is the last sentence of that paragraph, which is reducing time to authorization rather than a streamlined compliance framework? I keep circling back to Branko is like, what are we addressing symptoms or causes? And so I'm also keep mulling on that one, but I think we may have drifted away from the streamlined compliance framework to actions that reduce timeline to authorization, if that makes
Understood.
sense.
Are,
Okay.
are you saying that we should change this to streamline the existing compliance framework?
I think
I'm not
so,
being
and I think
facetious.
implement is maybe not the correct verb there. Because it is implemented, perhaps it's updating or modification.
Yeah, I think
Or
the goal we're
streamlining, yeah.
looking for is to reduce the time, I believe, is because that's what all these actions seem to be focused on.
Reduce time, reduce cost, reduce barriers. Yeah.
Yeah, cost and barriers, we'll have to see how that plays out. And those might be other recommendations or other sub-bullets that might be needed for those specific ones.
Thanks, Matt. Marcy, you have a hand up.
Yes, thank you, Marcia Shulman. Where is there going to be maybe this is an action item, like as a result when we're reviewing separately, but I feel like we should deconflict with our prior recommendations memo. It's hard, right? Like these are, it's very complex and there's a lot that is very interdependent on each other. And so I think it's difficult to not kind of go back to some of the items that we've talked about previously. So I just want to make sure there's an opportunity to deconflict from the previous recommendation memo.
Great point, Marcy. And I see Bill reacting with a thumbs up on that.
Perfect. Because some of it just sounds like eerily similar. And I say that tongue in cheek because I'm also repetitive. So
Yeah, it's all new to me because I wasn't here last year, but no, just kidding. Like Pete said at the last one, he spent time listening to every FSCAC meeting. I too have read every word that the FSCAC has published. So yeah, eerily similar is always fun. All right. Is anyone in need of a break? Do we want to discuss these first three further, knowing that we will have chance to deliberate on them and vote on them at a future meeting? Are we comfortable with what we have written right now for now? Mike.
Hey, Larry, I would love to get Marcy your feedback if there's enough focus on 3 POWs in these.
yeah.
Because I know that was one of the top lines, right, from the priority itself.
Agree. And I'm more of a digest and kind of process. I'm a processor, so going through this live is always a challenge for me personally. I think yes, I want to make sure that I can go through this and collaborate with the 3PO community as well, just to make sure we've captured it. I think number 2 is real important because that often has a real direct effect on how we interact with CSPs and what they can expect. Also, number 3 is very assessment impacting as well, and as well as how the agency like ingests the information. So noted, and I'd like to kind of take that as an action following the meeting.
Yep, Marcy, I appreciate that. And actually for all the committee members and members of the public who are observing today's meeting, we would welcome your comments. We want the committee to continue to do their deliberation and research. We want public comments as well. So thank you all for that. We are, I think, at a point where we can take a break. Michelle?
All right, great. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, or actually an 11-minute break, and we can be back at 1:20.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody.
All right, welcome back. Thank you guys for all of your participation today. We've had a great conversation so far. We'd like to go ahead and move to our final topic for the agenda. Larry, would you like to kick us off summarizing our next steps from this meeting and recapping any closing remarks you may have?
Yes. Let's see, let me turn my video on. Well, even without turning my video on, just again, thank you all for the great discussion and interaction around the first of our recommendations, the first of our priorities. So let's see, let me get in the right place. But I basically want to just continue the same deliberation around our second priority for about the next 45 minutes or so. So looking at this second priority, identify and publicly document ways to expedite the authorization process for CSOs, explore agile authorizations and other potential cost reductions, both labor and financial, with a focus on small businesses, e.g. ensure minimum risk threshold, minimum acceptability, standardized baselines for sponsoring agencies and 3PAOs. And note that we have received some committee notes that are at the bottom of the screen now on this. So this, again, we want to create our problem statement and actionable specific recommendations for this one, just like we did on the first priority in the first chunk of this meeting. So who would like to kick us off with initial thoughts on the problem statement or recommendations? And I invite you all to take a minute, read Kayla's notes at the bottom of the screen, and let's take it from there. I hope our discussion on this priority is as robust as the first one.
Can we see the problem statement again, please? All right, thank you.
Okay, we do have some hands up. We'll start with Jackie and then Bill. Jackie.
Yes, Jackie Snoffer from DISA. I just wanted to comment on one of Kayla's, or the first bullet that Kayla had out, as just as an idea generator. When we get the SAR from the 3PAO, our team actually does a quick risk review. And then I actually issue an IATT that allows the sponsoring organization to go through and start their build out, start testing with the infrastructure. They can't pass production data at that point, no CUI, but it does allow them to move forward so that they can begin to test and to build, you know, and that they can purchase. And so it has accelerated, and then that allows us time to finish the actual, what I'll call mechanics of issuing the provisional authorization in the department. And so, you know, it is a and then we can go forward in the department with a PA. We don't have to wait until it goes onto the marketplace. We go forward once the provisional authorization is issued. And so, you know, going to the marketplace then allows the federal side of the house to leverage our authorization. So I don't know what type of reciprocity, you know, you have, you know, if you were in the Department of the Interior and you were, let's say, the Park Service and you authorized a cloud, could other interior agencies actually leverage that cloud? You know, so before it goes to the marketplace, does it have to, what is the reasoning behind going to the FedRAMP marketplace? So, you know, it's an interesting construct, but we do allow testing at that IATT phase, and we have found that actually helps both the user, the mission owner, as well as the cloud service provider to actually be able to start working toward you know, the final authorization that opens up the floodgates for the rest of the department. But at least it's a testing, and it's a you know, is our processes working? You know, can we get on with our CAC cards and all of those kind of things? So it's just a suggestion, and it could probably be broadened out, you know, and more generalized. I just offer that as a concept for consideration in terms of a recommendation as we move forward.
Thank you, Jackie. Bill.
Jackie actually was going one of the same places that I was going. I think most federal agencies either have a provisional ATO, a lightweight ATO. We call ours an authority to test. Everybody's got some version of that thing. I don't think it's beyond reason for the FedRAMP program to be able to issue something like that. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad recommendation, but it would need to come with some like really heavy caveats that everybody understood, like, please don't take this to production until the work is done, because you shouldn't be issuing an ATO against a provisional ATO. So something like that, I think that we would really need to clarify. But I strongly agree that if one agency is doing it, then that should be good enough for all agencies if it's got the FedRAMP seal of approval somewhere on there for some subset of the controls that can be generally agreed upon and universal. So I think that's generally good. I also note that Kayla brought back the inheritance point here that we brought from the previous comment, which I think is really valuable for her second point. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is the third point here with regard to the exception process. I'm sure everyone is sick of me talking about this, but I'm going to talk about it again. So, you know, this committee proposed to OMB that there needs to be an expanded exception process that matched the original exception process, because this is disadvantageous to small business as well as to large businesses that have cutting edge solutions that need to get in the hands of the federal government faster. OMB has come back and said those have to be categorical. I don't think categorical is sufficient. So I foot stomp what Kayla is getting at here, which is some offerers will never be able to afford to go through the FedRAMP authorization process because it's more expensive than going through a lighter weight ATO process. That's just the facts, folks. And we need to be understanding of that. So I would say if this is a memo to the GSA Administrator, she is in a unique position to ask OMB to do the thing that they ignored us when this committee asked for instead. So I would ask that we ask again.
Thanks, Bill. Bronco, you're next.
And I would follow up on that. I was just looking for the list of participants. Bo is not here today, and I think he proposed this in one of the early FSCAC meetings, and I think it goes hand in hand with this recommendation, not only the exception process, but a tasking for, and I don't know if that's OMB or FedRAMP board or FedRAMP PMO, to come up with an authoritative guidance on the thresholds for ATO authorization. And if I remember correctly, he was talking about instances where ATO is not necessary, but because that guidance doesn't exist, agencies tend to over authorize even instances of services that don't necessarily need to go through the entire process. And I think it goes hand in hand with exceptions slash thresholds.
Yeah, did we ever get a solid definition of what an information system is in the first place? I still don't know if we've ever gotten that written down anywhere.
Hey, Bill, I want to also add on a clear definition of CUI from the government would be really beneficial.
Yikes.
Highlighted right now is just a problem statement that I just wrote as everyone was talking. I'm trying to keep it high level on this one. So please feel free to throw stones at it. I don't know if it hits everything that was in the priority or not. I think it does, but I just developed it on the fly.
Can I ask?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Apologies, this is Marcia Shulman. I was going to ask for a clarification. Just my understanding of the priority. This is primarily focused on expediting the authorization process, so shortening the timeline, correct? I guess we also say other cost reductions. Okay, so perhaps primary focus would be timeline to authorization. Sub-focus would be cost reductions as well, which feeds into that.
Great, Marcy, great question. I was going to ask Mike, where you say inconsistent requirements, do you mean that the requirements are inconsistent, or the way that that they're enforced are inconsistent?
It's probably the latter. So I would say application of, and that's that would clarify that, right? Inconsistent application of requirements, or validation potentially as well might be another good word in there.
Thank you.
And the point I'm driving on there was we see across both 3POWs as well as authorizing agencies different interpretations, even across different authorizing officials or TRs. Like we see different levels of what is acceptable or not depending on where we are, and that leads to non-standardization and also a little bit of the shell game by CSPs as they try to find places that they could have an easier authorization process or
yeah, it comes back to what was discussed in the previous discussion before the break about what are those things that are bold-faced, that are absolutely pass fail, and what are those things that that can be grouped together as these, some combination of these are must be met to meet the threshold. So there was a comment in the first discussion around transparency that said, we need to clarify what's absolute must have pass fail, and then what's that next tier of requirements that are aggregated. I hope I'm not misinterpreting that or misapplying that.
All right, Jackie, go ahead.
I'm gonna drop this in chat, but a recommendation, pulling some of these threads, would be for FedRAMP to implement a quick package look and issue an interim use on the marketplace for a CSO. This would allow agencies to go ahead and use a CSO at their own risk while FedRAMP continues the full evaluation. And I think one of the things that would be interesting to learn from FedRAMP is, how many packages and CSOs do they actually not put on, the marketplace, that come into them. I think there are challenges with some that you can always work through, but I think that would allow faster use of a CSO for them to recover their costs. That's one of the things I've been hammering. I know we've got, we connect to our NIPRNet, our private DoD unclassified network, and it takes a long time to get connected. Our provisional authorization process, we've been able to speed up. The connection is a little more difficult. And so, streamlining these processes is just so critical. And I foot stomp this with everybody that touches this, that this is really expensive for our cloud service providers. And we have got to find every means possible to manage our risk, and help the CSOs manage their financial risk so that we can use their products. And so that really is getting it to a market point where it can be used. And so I think that's just really a critical thing to keep in mind, that if you can do a quick look, you can go ahead and let people use it while you're working through some of the details that FedRAMP needs.
Hey,
Thanks,
Jackie.
Jackie.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mike.
I just had a quick question on that. Would you be looking at that as potentially varying levels of authorization based on varying sensitivity of the CUI data? Or are you looking at that as varying control application compliance levels for varying ATO? And if that doesn't make any sense, I could give an example.
Was having trouble coming off of mute. Sorry. I look at it as somebody had talked about what are those critical controls, as an authorizing official, the ones that I really look at are auditing and authentication. Other AOs have various families that they need to look at. But I would look at this as not varying levels, but a quick look to say, here are my top 20 or 30 controls as opposed to all 400. And, this looks like a tight package. It's good. There's an acceptable risk. In the department, we have a concept of red controls. Those are a lot of perimeter controls, and we have yellow. So we've picked out this subset of things before we will allow a system to connect. It's like 25 or 30 controls. And so that they can start their testing process and all of that type of thing. That's for regular systems. But that's what I'm thinking is just a smaller subset of controls that are deemed really necessary to be able to protect CUI in a moderate package, right? And let it go forward. You could apply that to say, okay, we're not going to process PII, and exclude that way, because sadly, the CUI registry has way too many items on it. But PII, PHI is one that's easy to pull out and say, okay, that one you can't do, it's for anything but, PII, PHI. So those are just my thoughts.
Got it. I'm going to recommend an action ask and projected benefits based on that I think aligns with what you're saying, because I had been drafting something similar. So I'm going to send it over to Darcy and see if this answers or aligns with what you're saying, Jackie. So it'll show up in the document shortly.
Thanks, Jackie. Mike, Marcy, you had your hand up. You took it down. Do you want to speak?
I lost my train of thought, so I'll raise it later if I come back to it. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. I'm loving the the thread that's going on here. And you know, Jackie, something you shared that is a practice in the department. I put in the notes here that, you know, it could be a best practice that we could, with red and yellow controls, that may meet what we're talking about here about, you know, the boldface must-haves, and then so that the idea of a quick look and a package check, and then a certain level of authorization to move forward. You know, it's something that we should definitely be considering. Marcy, your hand is up.
I am back. Thank you, Marcy Wishelman. So I will say I really like the suggestion and this idea for a few reasons, and I also like to say some of this exists in some capacity already. There is never, much to the chagrin of the DoD FedRAMP equivalency memo, there is never, if ever, a FedRAMP package that has 0 findings or 0 risks in it. And so there is the idea there are FedRAMP authorizations being granted, you know, week in and week out that are to systems with existing risk. And so there is a risk-based decision being made based on what risk is presented to say, hey, we're good with this, provided that you close it within the POAM remediation guidelines and within those timelines. So there is some sort of structure for this already, but if we could do it programmatically with some of the automation that is in the pipeline, I think there's a huge benefit that plays into everything that like Jackie and Mike have been talking about here. I have one more question for Bronco. As it pertains to like the work that y'all have done with the FedRAMP program, do you think that there is existing data in terms of maybe categorizing controls into higher levels of risk?
Yes, I was just looking for it yesterday.
Amazing.
So CISA has done extensive threat modeling with FedRAMP about 2 or 3 years ago. A lot of those results would need to be updated, but the data exists. We just need to find it. That would allow us to prioritize 853 controls based on the threat that we have observed in the wild, not theoretical prioritization, but very exact prioritization based on actual threat actions and TTPs that that industry has observed in the wild, and that allows us to not only prioritize controls based on the coverage against those threats, but also based on frequency of those threats, and that would allow us to come up with a list of top 10, 50, whatever the number is, controls that really matter. That ensure 80 or 90% coverage, and that would be a good starting point for prioritization of controls.
Thank you. I love that. I think that would be a great thing to integrate into this discussion in terms of it exists, it may need to be updated, and that's okay, but in terms of having a starting point to tying all of this together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marcy and Bronco, because yeah, we have to remember that the R in FedRAMP stands for risk, but it's risk management. You know, we can't avoid all risk, but understanding the equation of risk, which Bronco just mentioned, includes the probability of happening, is a huge part of this. So that would be really cool, really helpful. Thanks. Mike.
I'm just curious on the risk-based question, would it be beneficial for us to recommend to the GSA Administrator to meet with NIST, or are there other agencies that would be able to provide that kind of standardization around controls and which controls belong to which category of family categories? Like, I just don't, I think NIST might be the right organization. I just don't know. If somebody's a little bit smarter than me on this one.
And Matt is our NIST rep. Matt had to drop for a few minutes. I don't know if he's back yet, but Bronco, of course, CISA as well, in terms of cybersecurity authority for the federal government. So did you want to comment?
Would you mind repeating the question? I was trying to type up the recommendation.
No problem. Yeah. So just talking about like the minimum acceptable risk-based baselines. Would that be something like we should ask like partners in NIST or CISA or other agencies to participate in the development of that, since we're looking at, creating basically a standard? So rather than FedRAMP just saying this shall be the standard, like, is that something we should be partnering or working through other organizations within the US government?
Well, definitely whenever it comes to any type of authoritative definition or thresholds or risk, CISA, again, for cybersecurity, as well as NIST, need to be consulted. So this should never be developed in a vacuum by none of these bodies.
Okay, perfect. I'm only asking that because I'm trying to draft up something around the risk-based baseline and want to make sure we got the ask correct.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. In terms of the, obviously NIST manages the standards and CISA helps to set the prioritization. I think, Bronco, I characterized that fairly accurately.
Great.
And of course, OFCIO with an OMB for the policy end.
Thanks, Bill.
Got it. That was OFM?
What I just said?
Yeah.
OFCIO.
Office
Part
of
of
the Federal
OMB.
Office of the Federal CIO at the Office of Management and Budget.
They have
Got
most
it.
of the policy authority over cybersecurity that hasn't been delegated to CISA. So just in the grand hierarchy of things.
Got it. Sounds good. I think I got it correct.
Well
throw it
put.
over. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, it's I mean, in government terms, it's fairly streamlined. That, of course, was my personal comment, not representing the opinions of my agency.
So I threw some language together and I'm sharing it with Darcy right now around what we just discussed. Let me know if I captured that properly, especially on the ask part.
So, Marcy, your hand is up.
It is. Thank you, Marcy with Shulman. I was rereading the priority statement and, we've been focused on authorization and, largely like the initial assessment process. One thing that we haven't spent much time on is the readiness assessment, the RAR process in the FedRAMP program. And I will say that the RAR process has changed significantly and evolved over time since it was rolled out in, I think, 2017-ish. So, kind of the idea initially was that it was a readiness assessment demonstrate a cloud service offering's ability to kind of, and let me know if y'all can't hear me. I'm getting the unstable alert on my Zoom, but around the ability for an organization to actually be successful or offering be successful when it goes through the initial assessment process for authorization. So I think that some of this tiering that we've talked about, the RAR process might want to be considered in that because I think that was perhaps some of the initial consideration around ready. It has evolved to be much more, I would say, cumbersome and detail oriented. But I just wanted to throw it out there because I think it's impactful and it might solve some of these things that we've identified, maybe not necessarily authority to that or authority to test, but it may serve a role in that tiering that we've discussed. Open floor, I don't know if anyone has any response or any additional thoughts or even really much experience with the RAR process, but it is something that still does exist within the program and provides some of that capability.
Thanks, Marcy. And we only lost you for a second or two, so we definitely caught most of everything you said.
Perfect. Thank you.
Additional comments, thoughts?
And if there are none, I can think about the RAR as I do our kind of secondary review and add in some commentary where I think it may be appropriate for later discussion.
That would be great, Marcy. Greatly appreciated.
Of course.
I really, the individual research that committee members are doing that are bringing to these suggestions and these proposals is extraordinarily helpful and appreciated.
Hey, Larry, I had one, it's a new thread. Sorry, Marcy, not on the topic that you just brought up, but definitely look forward to reading that. I was curious, have we explored ever for small service providers, if there's an ability for the US government to do some kind of financial support or incentive program for them? Like, do we have the power to do block grant, or maybe block grants is incorrect, but maybe just grants in general, or some kind of cost sharing models with them? Is that something we've ever thought about or explored? And I'm kind of pitching it out there in general. I know, not to you directly, Larry.
I feel like we talked about this. Sorry, this is Bill from the SEC again. I feel like we've talked about this a couple of times about potential opportunities to get some work done through the SBA 8A loan program for small businesses to target specifically around like cybersecurity enhancements and things like that. I don't know that there is an existing fund there. I don't believe there is a dedicated one, but you know, there are general grants available there for 8As. And definitely something that potentially could be taken up by the legislative side of things, particularly for those of you all who are allowed to lobby. That would be something to think about.
Gotcha. Do you think we have an appetite maybe under this priority, since it's one of the focus, because we focused a lot on the time for authorization, but there is also the reduction of cost, I believe, in the priority language. Would this be something, other cost reductions, would this be something that we would want to maybe potentially draft up as a recommendation?
Did we recommend this last year? Is my only thing. I thought that we specifically said something about that, but I could be wrong. I know we talked about it last year.
Yeah, let me go double check on that one.
Yeah, but I am a massive proponent of small business loans for disadvantaged small businesses, personally, particularly to be able to compete in this arena. I think that is an excellent idea. I would like to see more attention to it, if at all possible. And it looks like I'm being live fact checked. I thought that we said that there was not going to be any fact checking during this debate.
Oh dear. Mike, your hand's up.
Yeah. So were we able to find it or not in that search? If not, we should probably, I could draft up some language maybe if we want to consider it.
So the search
Happy
is
to
live
collaborate
on the
on
screen.
that too.
Yep.
Sorry, I didn't catch that on my end. It came up a little jarbled.
Sorry, I was just saying I'm happy to collaborate with you on that, if it is all helpful.
Cool. Yeah, I'll throw together something quick, and then we could throw it into the notes, and then we could review it offline and come back next session.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you both.
No problem. I'll get that going right now. Darcy, I'll send it over to you in just a few minutes.
Okay, does anyone need to scroll to a different part of the screen? Additional thoughts, additional input? So right now at the top of the screen, there's the priority that we're discussing. That's our draft problem statement. And then, boy, we've got a nice lot of proposed actionable specific recommendations. Obviously, we need to tweak them, make sure that like we did with the earlier discussion, that we make it clear who and what. But this is a great start. want to give everybody time to follow what's going on the screen, because a 7th draft recommendation has been added with subparts. So again, take a look at that, jump in, raise your hand if you have questions or comments. And if you want to add additional subparts, edit the ones that you see, or add another one. Bronco.
Well, once again, explore and establish, but who? Who is that recommendation for? We need to be very specific in terms of our expectations. And
That's a copy paste thing. Hold on. I think Darcy's cleaning it up right now.
And Joshua Cohen.
Hi, sorry, I was late today. Just
Welcome.
I'm here and didn't make it for the earlier first half of the call. I just had a question on this. I was going to suggest perhaps the SBA as well was to the first part there. They're normally the ones that can have the best ability to get loans. But I was also interested in, is it something where the agencies who would, like in a similar way that an agency sponsors a cloud provider to ensure that we are authorizing cloud providers and someone actually has the interest and willingness to work with, would that be something that we would want to weave into that financial support? Or is it just something where a small interesting company decides they want to apply for it? Sorry if that was something that was mentioned earlier when this came up.
I don't think it was mentioned earlier. I appreciate you bringing it up. Thoughts from the committee? So I did hear you say for 7A, not just GSA's Office of Small Business Utilization, but also the SBA. Am I mischaracterizing that?
No.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, SBA would be, of course, the primary loan program for small businesses in the government.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks.
Sorry, this is Naman Ansari from the Small Business Administration. Sorry, I wasn't able to raise my hand there. Just a clarification on the loans. The authority to establish a loan programs flows through the appropriations. So that would be something we'd have to work through the appropriators, and it's not something the SBA could stand up by its own.
Yeah, sorry, doubling down on that. That's what I was mentioning earlier, that there's existing authorities within the 8A program for loans for small businesses, but not specifically to this topic.
Yeah, so thank you, Naman and Bill. So again, if we're making recommendations to the GSA administrator, some of these recommendations, we must recognize that some of them may require legislation, et cetera. But still understanding what the timeline is and what we're asking for, that doesn't restrict us from making the recommendations if we think that that's what's going to help address these priorities. Bronco, your hand's still up.
It's a mistake. My apologies.
Not at all. Again, I really appreciate the robust discussion, the screen full of language and all the thought that this reflects the work that you've done between meetings and the equities that you're all bringing to the table. So I don't want to cut it short, but I do want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the committee members and the thought that you're putting into this. Understanding, as we clarified earlier, that this is not the final vote. We're not voting on these today. We're not finalizing them. This is our initial proposal, and we understand that we're going to. I think it was Marcy that said, "I need time to think, digest, and process," and we do. So between this meeting and the next one, we will have time to review these, think about them, engage with our stakeholder communities as individual research, and then come back to the committee for the deliberative process. If there are no more thoughts and if there is no more thought and discussion on priority 2, we can also go back to priority 1 if the committee wants to use the time. We've had a couple folks that weren't able to be here for that first part of the meeting. One more look at that, and we may end up wrapping up a little early today. But I want to use your time, I want to respect your time, and I want to use it well, because I think we've had a very productive meeting to this point. So on the screen, we've gone back to priority 1 and the problem statement that we worked up in the first part of the meeting, just to give everybody a chance to look at that, think about it. And again, we understand that we're not voting on these today.
Larry, I assume you're not looking at your screen. There are a couple of us with our hands raised.
I am so sorry.
No need to apologize. I figured that you also looked away and
Yep, Bronco, thank you. I appreciate that. So Bronco first and then Mike.
So thinking back about my previous comment about not really having enough data about the timeline, the timelines cost in terms of both resources, money, and time, I guess. How do we know that these recommendations are really properly prioritized and that they're hitting the most significant issues in the barriers to entry? And again, I really want to raise this question with all of my colleagues. Do we still need to do do we still need additional data, or does someone need to do additional research? Do we feel confident that what we have here as recommendations will address what we believe to be the burden to entry or barriers to entry? Just want to make sure that we are not distracted and or moving in a completely wrong direction just because we didn't have the data to address the original problem.
And Bronco, that's exactly why I put my hand up too. So we do have a list of things that we talked about previously. So I just was going to kind of tick through those and see if there's anything on that list that we want to address. So we did talk in the past around, and I'll just kind of punch these like one by one, but we talked about pre-assessment tools for faster authorization and automation around that, which I think we've addressed in priority 1. We've talked about a reciprocity framework in the past. We do have a marketplace. I'm crossing that one out. We talked about provisional ATOs, which I think we actually included in this one on the first half. Continuous monitoring and reporting was another area that was a major concern around cost, especially on the agency side of the house. And I think Jackie was a big proponent of anything we could do to lower that barrier, to reduce that cost. And then there were some other smaller things we've talked about in the past, like public-private partnerships, open source compliance or open compliance. And then we also talked about low-hanging fruit was regular FedRAMP training and workshops, and then also documentation, a single source of documentation. So those were some of the major categories that we've talked about before. And I can repeat those for anybody if any of those trigger you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Bronco, for asking the question.
And again, also given the FedRAMP PMO and everyone else's limited resources, we should probably consider in our future discussions prioritization of these recommendations and also reducing the number of recommendations to a meaningful number with the biggest possible impact.
Yes, excellent suggestion. Mike, hand still up?
Sorry, that's just taking it down.
I did not want to not call on you. All right, well, I think we have got a lot of material here today to take back, think about, deliberate on, and come back to the next meeting with additional comments, recommendations. We are not going to take a break, I don't think. So with that, let me just turn it over. Do I turn it over to you, Michelle, or do I roll right into closing remarks?
You can, if you'd like, we're at the final topic of the agenda today. So if you'd like to just kick us off summarizing our next steps from this meeting and recapping any closing remarks.
All right. Well, listen, again, I'm just so appreciative of your active participation in today's meeting. I think we have made really great strides in our initial drafting of our report to the administrator on the first two priorities. Before closing today, I would like to ask you all, the committee, if there are any gaps that would require further information or clarification during our next meeting in order to start finalizing the recommendations for these two priorities. And also, are there additional specific speakers that we'd like to hear from? So that I'm kicking that back out to you. Any gaps or clarification on what we did today, and any specific speakers that we'd like to hear from potentially in the next meeting? Mike.
Hey, Larry, just
great. We got Mike, Bill, and Jackie in that order.
On the speakers, I think having Pete maybe come back and give a sense of how the first 30, 60 days are going for him as the director, with things he's prioritizing, where he's focusing now that he's starting to get into the role.
Thanks, Mike. And I think Pete's listening to this live, so but we will we'll take that down as a request, a speaker request. Bill?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always down to hang out with Pete. That sounds like fun to me. But I would also recommend, if I don't know if we can share whatever draft version we have coming out of this meeting for public feedback again. I feel like the last meeting we got a whole bunch of really good comments, but I think this is another good opportunity to ping the community and see if we're getting it right or not, or if there's other ideas that we haven't considered. I know we've all read through the submitted comments very closely and seen a bunch of things in there, but just whether or not folks have other specific ideas that we didn't cover today and that could improve things for, again, particularly my attention is to the small businesses, but the overall program. I think this would be a good opportunity to provide that feedback on these specific topics. So maybe we could put another call out on LinkedIn and other social medias for that. Always happy to repost.
Bill, absolutely great suggestion. I can tell you, I had folks come back to me after I posted that request on LinkedIn, encouraging public comment. it even resulted in a mention, one media mention that, you know, that the FSCAC is looking for public comment. And I was thrilled about that. So I encourage all of you to use your social media channels, your social media channels to draw attention to the work that we've done today and invite public comment. And for the members of the public who are participating in today's meeting, please submit comments on our form.
I will
Bill?
say that the media mentions a great point. I mean, if GSA wanted to put out a press release on this topic, that would probably be helpful as well. Just throwing that out there.
Thank you. Jackie.
Two things, and this very well may have been discussed at the last meeting that I missed, and I do apologize for that. But where I'd like to hear what GSA took from our memo and what has been implemented by FedRAMP or the other people that were call outs in last year's recommendations. And the other one is, where are we in the transition and with the OMB memo? You know, I have a perspective, it may be different than others, but I would really like to hear, and I'm concerned about it from our cloud providers and from our 3 PAOs. You know, do they believe that, you know, are they experiencing impact from the OMB transition? Is it good? Is it bad? You know, because I think that may inform some of the things that we might recommend to the GSA Administrator, where we might end up with gaps from the implementation of the OMB memo. Over.
Thanks, Jackie. And I think your comment has generated a couple more hands. So we'll go to Matt next and then Marcy.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Actually, thinking about something a little different. And if you covered this, I apologize. I had to step out for a little bit from a call from my boss. But as far as next steps, you know, we're on CR to December 20. And as a Fed, I'm often very concerned about asking agencies to do things without having them adequately or properly resourced to actually make change, let alone continue with current operations. So, you know, maybe this is a Pete talk or, but how has CR potentially affected resourcing and the potential impacts to achieving the goals that that the program is looking for? And then how can we as a board advocate for the program so that they are properly resourced to achieve those goals?
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Marcy's captured it, I think, perfectly. And I said Darcy when I said Marcy when I meant to say Darcy. So Marcy, you're up next.
No problem. I've been called much worse. My question, it really spun off of Jackie's comment. I know, like, there are so many things that I think would be helpful or that are relevant to our 2 priorities that may already be on the roadmap as a result of the OMB memo or just on the overall like program modernization. And I'm curious, because I had a thought earlier and withheld it. I guess I'm curious, is there any guidance that you have or the committee members have on like when it might be appropriate to kind of include that in our commentary and recommendations here as it's relevant? I don't want to duplicate as either, but I want to make sure that if there are things like the program authorization as an additional, you know, way to access FedRAMP, I think that's really key. So just want some guidance on when it may be appropriate to include that type of information that may already be covered.
Yeah, thanks, Marcy. And I think that sort of, you know, the understanding the roadmap, the timeline, understanding, obviously we all know when the memo came out, and we've all, I think those of us, particularly those of us who are government employees, understand the time it takes to react to an OMB memo, the time it takes to implement a program, implement priorities, et cetera. So, you know, these things don't happen overnight. However, getting an update on the timeline, I think is a, you know, it's a reasonable request. So that way, as you pointed out, as we work on these priorities, as we work on our recommendations, we can understand how they fit and that we're not recommending something that's already being done. So thank you for that. Any additional hands? Seeing none, Michelle, let me turn the meeting over to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Larry. I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. We really appreciated your feedback and participation. With that, I will go ahead and adjourn our meeting. We've taken notes and we'll be in touch with our next board meeting date. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Michelle.
everybody.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.